in April of 1860, they were meeting for a Democratic to run for president of the United States, the Democratic Party. The Republican Party was going to have its nomination in June of 1860, 2 months later. The Democratic Party was used to nominations. They had been in existence since 1840, 1836, 1840, when the Democratic Party was formed. And after Andrew Jackson was renominated, the conventions became very important. Conventions to nominate presidents became important. Van Buren in 1836 onward, to 1860. In Charleston, the Democratic Party met. Now, of all the cities in the United States at that time in 1860, in all the cities, I know everybody. Was it the traffic?
We had another class.
Because nobody knows where you are.
Oh, okay.
It's not over yet anyway.
Marco here.
In Charleston, South Carolina was probably the least likely of all the cities, over 25,000 people in the United States at that time. Charleston had only 30,000 people. Charleston was the least city in all of America that would welcome a person who was not sympathetic to slavery. Some kind of way, someone running for president. And in 1860, believe it or not, where you had the convention was a lot more important than it is today. Today we have primaries that decide candidate elections. In 1860, they didn't have primaries. They depended on a smoke-filled cigar chopping guys in the back room deciding who was going to become president. In other words, influential people at the convention in the Democratic Party. There was no really yet, in 1860, there was no yet organization to set up a system where the people could decide who would become their nominee for president of the United States. The people left it to the states, and the states really were not that, especially in the South, they were only trying to protect their interests. They weren't trying to necessarily get a national candidate. They wanted to get somebody that would just protect their states. In 1860, there was beginning, if you want to talk about a smoke-filled convention, if you ever want, that was the year that a person could become nominated in either the Democratic or the Republican Party by a small group of people in a room, hidden behind, within the walls. Now, each state basically had basically its representation according to its population. In other words, New York had more people than Connecticut, and But still, it was proportionate nomination, but still, and there was nobody really running in the Democratic Party for president except of a national scale, except Stephen A. Douglas, who had just become senator of Illinois and was very instrumental in the Kansas-Nebraska Act and in politics at that time. Buchanan was the president of the United States. He did not want to become president again. He was like a caretaker president. And he sat back. But the one person he did not want to be president of the United States from his own party was Stephen A. Douglas. So anyway, Buchanan was a person that was very upset with Douglas because Douglas had opposed. You see, Buchanan was from Pennsylvania, but he was a supporter of the slave. He had become into power because he okayed slavery. He felt slavery was all right, even though he was from Pennsylvania. But he was, and there was at that time a balance between the North and the South that was almost equally divided in electoral power. 45% of the people were probably from the South, 55% of the people were from the North. And the 45% were very careful that they would not be overrun by the 55%. So they had built-in mechanisms to try to keep their power equal. Buchanan, who owed his presidency to the South in large part because of the support that they gave him, even though he came from Pennsylvania, basically supported the idea that slavery could be extended into the territories. Kansas was being formed at the time. Kansas was a state that would probably be a free soil state, a state that would not want to have slaves among the majority of the people that were in Kansas. But there were always some people that wanted to have slaves in Kansas. So Douglas came up with a proposition that the people of his territory should decide whether or not they should have slavery. Let the people in the territory decide whether they want to have slavery. The South knew that Kansas was probably going to be a free state because Kansas didn't have the cotton, it had wheat, which was not grown by blacks. It was grown by, you could have a small farm and grow wheat. You didn't need blacks. You didn't need slaves. So basically, Kansas was, in order to extend slavery in Kansas, they had to have minority rule. They had to have the minority have slaves. Because most of the people would be voting against it. Okay? Douglas had proposed that the people should decide. And that would mean they would eliminate the slaves in Kansas, because the people would decide that nobody could have slaves. Buchanan created a constitution, listening to the South, said, let's have a plebiscite in Kansas as to whether, but he didn't say slavery or no slavery. He only said that slaves should be, that if you have a slave, you keep a slave. Or if you don't have a slave, you can get a slave. In other words, you can't have slaves at all. But if you have a slave that you bring in, you can keep that slave. Or you can not only have that slave, but you can get other slaves. That was called the Compton Constitution. Douglas was against that. He was against Buchanan's proposal. That made Buchanan very upset with Douglas. And he says, I'm not supporting Douglas. Anybody but Douglas. So now the only one running for president was Douglas. There wasn't a candidate that was coming around to oppose Douglas. The South decided, instead of getting a candidate to coalesce against Douglas, certain people in the South, as I said, about 50 of the 303 representatives, felt, let's just not put up a candidate. Let's create, instead of worrying about a candidate, let us worry about what is said in the platform. What is said, what do we stand for? What do we stand for? Not who we want. This was the first convention, and maybe the last, that ever had as its proposal, instead of a candidate, because remember there were no primaries, a position. A position. And that position was a constitutional right to have slavery. That a majority, unlike what Douglas is doing, cannot tell the minority that they can't have slaves. That we have a constitutional right to have slaves because slaves are pieces of property. And you can't take our property away from us. Because we don't take the property of the North away from us without paying them something. So let us instead have a constitutional right to own slaves because they are pieces of property. And we can't take our property away from us. And you know what they also said? That slavery is basically right. Slavery is okay. People who thought this way were led by William. If you need any chairs, They're over there, but I don't know if you need them yet. We're led by William Yancey, who is from Alabama, who I told you about at the last 2 lectures that I've had. Now, Yancey wasn't for a candidate, he was for a position. And this was the only time that a convention was met for a position. And all of a sudden, when you think about it, this is the first time that we're talking about a position that we have a constitutional right to own slaves. So, Yancey got together with other people. First of all, he got the Alabama delegation. He was from Alabama. He got the Alabama delegation supporting him with that position, that we will not support Douglas because Douglas doesn't stand, unless Douglas changes his position and says you have a constitutional right to have slavery. Now, to Lincoln and to the Republican Party, Douglas's position that slavery should be decided by the people was all wrong to Lincoln and most of the people in the Republican Party, because now Lincoln was saying, and the people in the Republican Party was saying, that slavery is wrong. And we can't eliminate slavery where it is, but we should eliminate slavery where it's going in, like in Kansas. It's wrong to have slaves. Even though it's legally right, it's morally wrong. Douglas took the position that it's not morally right, it's not morally wrong, but the people, well, he takes the position, it's moral to have the people decide. The people should decide. So if you have a group of people that are taking one position, the minority can't prevail. So Yancey got Alabama to go along with it, but he was a great organizer, and it was done behind the scenes. As they were meeting in April, he started to see who else felt the position that he felt besides South Carolina. And he found there were 6 or 7 other states, and he was able to get about 45, 50 delegates. So, since they weren't coalescing around a candidate, they were coalescing around a position, Douglas refused to change his position. He said, this is what I stand for. Let the people decide. Let the people decide whether it's right or wrong. Slavery, it's not important, because slavery is, to a lot of people, is right. To a lot of people, slavery is wrong. Let the people decide. So Kansas was basically, the situation in Kansas which happened was the thing that started this position in 1860 by Yancey. And I told you 3 weeks ago, that Douglas expected to get the nomination because there was no one against him. He had no particular person that he could see out there fighting him, opposing him. And he would have gotten the nomination had he had majority rule effective. Remember, I told you New York, the northern states had 55% of the vote, but he couldn't get 2/3. And what happened was, they met on April 23rd in Charleston. And Charleston had this position that they didn't want to make it appear like it was a raucous convention. So they required that for every 3rd seat had to be occupied by a woman. A woman could not vote, but she had to be at the convention. So they made it appear, why did they do that? They wanted to keep that Southern courtesy, that Southern etiquette. And so people would come in with women who were not, in those days they weren't that up on it. Most of these women who were coming were people that were, it was the thing to do, the thing to go to, the young girls, the pretty ones. In other words, let's go out. Instead of going to a party, let's go to the convention. They occupied that convention. 1/3 of them, 2/3 of these, and this same thing happened, by the way, in the Republican Party. It's a funny thing. So they get into this place called the Institute Hall, and it's going down the main street, and it's cobblestones all around it. And the preacher gets up to give the invocation on April 23rd. No one could hear him. Why? Because the horses were going along the cobblestone streets. So the only one that could hear the prayers of the preacher were the people up in heaven. You know, they couldn't hear a thing. In other words, the communication was so bad that they couldn't even communicate. So they got rid. They said, "Let's get the hay on the road. Let's stop the horses going down the street, and let's get down to business." That was on April 23rd, a Monday, April 23rd, 1860. It took them till Friday, April 27th, 4 days. Oh, they took out. So now they said, "Let's put it into a committee as to what the platform will stand for." Before they elected the candidate, they were trying to create a platform. They didn't want to have, in other words, the South did not want to have Douglas nominated. So they said, let's create the platform first. Let's create the platform. And then the party candidate basically will be obligated to support that platform. Because otherwise, why would we nominate somebody? If the platform is so important, we're making it first. It took them 4 days, from April 23rd to April 27th, to create the platform. The platform comes back. They have maybe about 40 people on the platform out of the 303 people. The majority in the platform said that slavery is a constitutional right to have slaves. That the federal government or a territory can't tell the people of that territory you can't have slaves. That was the majority report. That was not the majority of the people in the convention. Majority of the people in the convention from the North. That came up on April 27th, on a Friday. Douglas was dismayed. He says, "I can't run on this platform. This is not what I stand for. Who are you going to put against me?" And then Yancey gets up in front of the convention. Or, you remember I told you about Yancey collecting Alabama? Well, what did he do from April 23rd to April 27th? He met with all the southern states, all the leaders, from Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Texas, Florida, Louisiana, Georgia, those states, along with South Carolina. And they got a majority, not everybody, but they got a majority of those people in those southern states to take the Yancey position. And Yancey's position was, and he got up on April 27th and said it, "We are a distinct minority." Well, I don't know if they were such a distinct minority when they got all those states, but he wanted to say we are a minority. He wanted to feel like he was being picked on. We are the distinct minority. We are being picked on. We have a right to slavery. We have a right, and we have been in this union long enough, and we have always listened to the North. And whenever a Northerner supports slavery like Buchanan, the president, did, we're against him. I mean, we're really giving in to him. He's not giving in to us. We're giving in to him. And we basically want a platform where we have a constitutional right to own slaves in the new territories. And he said it so eloquently, so smoothly. And remember, he had already gotten 7 states to support him. But he also said, if you do not, and this was new, if you do not support my position, Alabama, South Carolina, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, Texas, we're all leaving the party. We're going to split the party up. And if, God forbid, we should get a Republican as president because we split up the North against the South and the Democratic Party, so be it. Let whoever the Republican is become president of the United States. We will not succumb anymore. He basically said that. He didn't say it outwardly, we're getting out. He said, but he had, and then a distinct silence went over the room. And George Pugh from Ohio got up. He was the only one that basically was not in a daze. And he got up and he said, "How dare you, Mr. Yancey? How dare you say that?" And as soon as he said, "How dare you," commotion rang over the floor. And Caleb Cushing, who was Caleb Cushing? He was the guy that was running the convention. He was from Massachusetts. Caleb Cushing, you think, being from Massachusetts, would be supporting the North. But you remember I told you that the South had shipped its cotton to England? Where do you think they got the ships from? They didn't build ships. They didn't have any industry in the South. They got from Caleb Cushing, Massachusetts. And Caleb Cushing was basically, even though he's from the North, he was basically, and he was a convention presider. He was the guy in charge of the convention. He was basically supporting the southern position because he was basically as interested with the South, even though he's from Massachusetts. So Caleb Cushing, basically, and Caleb Cushing is very important later on. I'll tell you in a little while. But Caleb Cushing, suddenly, with this uproar going on, couldn't feel that anything could be done. And instead of invoking order, he said, adjourned, April 27th. And now we didn't know what was going on. April 28th was a Saturday. Generally, Charleston was very dry that time of year. There was no rain. All of a sudden it came down. April 28th, people, remember the women were there. They come in, 1/3 of the places with women, 2/3 of men. None of them are carrying umbrellas. Because there's another balmy day in Charleston. All of a sudden, around 10 o'clock, storm comes, and it goes on. Lunchtime comes, nobody's got their food, nobody's got their umbrellas, they're stuck there. And now they're all angry as heck with each other. Finally, nothing gets done. But Douglas gets up and says, we have to have, he doesn't get up in front of the convention, but his people say, let's have a vote on the floor. April 30th. On Sunday, they take the day off. They're still bargaining. April 29th. April 30th comes around, Monday. Now it's a little bit less rainy. The women are still there. The men are there. April 30th, a vote comes down on the convention as to whether they should take that position of that committee that slavery is right. By a vote of 165. Remember, there are 303 people in the convention. Remember? I think it's right. 165 to 138 made 303, I think. 165 to 138, they overrule the committee and take Douglas's position. Remember what Yancey had told them? Yancey had told them, if you overrule this, we're walking out of the convention. 165, 138, overruled. We are going to have Douglas's position that the people shall decide whether they should have slavery or not. 165. Remember, there was no other body. It was just Douglas on that position or Douglas and without that position. 165 to 138, they said, we will take Douglas's position. After all, majority should have. But remember, it required 2/3 vote to elect the president. Even though the majority ruled on 165 to 138, it still took 2/3 to get a president, to get a nominee. They weren't going to vote for Douglas, not 1/3 of them. So what happened? They left. They adjourned, said, April 30th, we can't get anything. They adjourned. So what? The big thing happened. All of a sudden, Yancey gets up from Alabama. Alabama leaves. Florida leaves. All quietly. They just walked out of the convention. So we're forming our own convention. We're forming our own convention in Charleston. We're going to the St. Andrew's Church. And they go into the St. Andrew's Church, and they say, we are the real convention. That convention is the rump convention. Now, Douglas wanted to get some of these people out, but he didn't want to get 7 states out. He'll never get 2/3 that way. And remember, Caleb Cushing's still in charge. Remember I told you he's running it? So now the people who are left say to Caleb Cushing, who's in charge, well, let's get 2/3 of the people that are in this room. And what do you think Caleb Cushing says? He's running the convention. No. You got to get 2/3 of the whole vote. Even if the people have left the room, they count. So Caleb Cushing basically supported William Yancey's position of walking out and creating mayhem. May 1 goes by. Meanwhile, they're meeting St. Andrew's Church, the 7 states, and they say, let's wait. Let's not do anything. Let's see what they're going to do over there at Institute Hall. Now the women have suddenly left the convention because the thing to do now is to go to the rebel side. So all the women have at least left, who are, you know, and now it's coming, now the place seems to be empty because 1/3 of the seats were reserved and they went over to the other place. By May 3rd, after 23 ballots, Cushing says, let's adjourn. And everybody agrees, let's adjourn until June 2018, after the Republican Party meets. Remember, I told you the Republican Party was meeting in June, early June. We will meet after. And at least this is what Douglas did. He said to himself, if I'm stuck with 2/3, I'm going back to Alabama, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and I'm going to get other delegates who support my position. To get the 2/3, I'll forget about those people. I'm going to get new candidates, new electorals from those states, in spite of what Cushing says. And that's basically what he did. He didn't do it himself. He got his group to organize all those states. While that is going on, they leave on May 3rd. Now, in a drop of a hat, I mean, very quickly, very, very quickly, people from Tennessee who had slaves, people from Kentucky who had slaves, people from Missouri who had slaves, who didn't want to break up of this union, suddenly said, we got to do something. And they met 6 days later, on May 9th, in a very patchwork position, and they put up a candidate to save the Union. His name was John Bell, an old hawk in his 60s, an old Whig, Whig hawk, an old Whig, who was past his prime, way past his prime. He was almost decrepit. And John Crittenden was trying to save the Union, put him up in these slave states that were basically wanted to keep the Union together. Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee. And that thing, above all, made Lincoln become the nominee for President of the United States. Believe it or not. What did they do that for? They knew they could not get John Bell elected President of the United States. But does anybody can figure out why they did that? Old men that didn't want to see young men die in a war, if there was going to be a war. And they were thinking that there might be a war over this. They were about the only people that thought there might be a war over this. The Constitutional Union Party put up John Bell to run for president from Tennessee, who was a slave owner, who hated the Lecompton Constitution. Remember I told you about Douglas? He was supporting Douglas on that position. He thought that Buchanan was wrong. And it was the only way it was, and this is what made Lincoln become the guy that became, instead of Seward in the Republican Party, it was a way to stop the Republicans from winning or the Democrats from winning. Because if you put up a third candidate named John Bell in the border states, you could have Kentucky, Tennessee, and those states vote for him. And if they vote for him, there could be an electoral vote that is not a majority. And if it's not a majority, it goes into the Senate and the House. And maybe smart people will prevail and stop a war and stop the breakup of the Union if we have a candidate. They jumped the gun because, remember, the Democratic Party had already split in two. They already had basically 3 candidates. And there was probably a good chance that there would be an electoral split anyway if you have if you have a Southern Democrat, a Northern Democrat, and a Republican. A Republican who's basically only in the North. So basically you have, but what did they do? They created a fourth problem. They created a 4th candidate. They thought it would be the 3rd candidate, but they created a 4th candidate, John Bell. John Bell and Edward Everett from Massachusetts, who was later in the Gettysburg Address, the guy that spoke out before Lincoln. Those 2 guys ran for president on the Constitutional Union Party, and they didn't have a platform. All they had was, because they didn't want to say they were for this or against it, all they said is we want to keep the country together. So now you had a constitutional union party. You didn't have a Democratic Party electing. They were in shambles. You had a constitutional union man, John Bell, only in 3 or 4 states. And the Republican Party is now going to Chicago to nominate a candidate in Chicago. Any questions? All right, about half done. Republican Party. Who is the favorite to win? Now, unlike the Democratic Party, we have people that are running against each other. Republican Party had never won a national election. It had been formed only 4 years before, in 1856. It was hungry for power. Hungry for power. It was looking, whoever could win, we won. On one condition, against slavery. But everybody in the Republican Party was formed to be against slavery. So anybody who joined the Republican Party was basically against slavery. But now they wanted to win. And there was no other person but Douglas in the South. And now they had the door was suddenly left wide open to the Republican Party. Because the Democratic Party was breaking itself up. Whoever got the nomination of the Republican Party was probably going to become president of the United States. And the party was only 4 years old. Most of the people in that party were Whigs, old Whigs. The Whig Party fell apart. The Republican Party came about because there was no other party and it filled the vacuum. And now with John Brown's raid and all this, now there was an attitude slavery is morally wrong. The favorite to win was the former governor of New York, William Seward. Against him, there was Edward Bates from Missouri. Edward Bates. In addition to him, the governor of Pennsylvania, Simon Cameron. And then you had Abe Lincoln from Illinois. You had Lincoln, Seward, Bates, and you also had Salmon Chase from Ohio. If you look at the $10,000 bill, who's on the cover of the $10,000 bill? Salmon Chase. Nobody else knows that. We all are not carrying $10,000 bills in our pocket. Salmon Chase is on the $10,000 bill.
And the bank.
And Lincoln, by the way, is on the 5. So I don't know. Lincoln beat Chase, but in your words, Chase would beat Lincoln. So Lincoln's on the 5. So these guys are running for president. And they're all taking the position that slavery is wrong. All of them. But not so much as Bates, because he's from Missouri, and it's a slave state. Salmon Chase was the senator of Ohio, senator from Ohio. And Salmon Chase really didn't make a run for it. He was like sitting in the background, sitting in the shadows, waiting to see somebody slip. He didn't get an organization together, although he said, I'll take it if they give it to me. And he was hoping to become president more than anybody, probably, but he wasn't running. He was too dignified to run. He was waiting for the others to collapse. Bates came from Missouri. In 1856, I told you the Republican Party was formed. At that time, the Know Nothing Party was actually the second most powerful party in the United States because the Republican Party had just been formed and had been the Know Nothing Party. What did the Know Nothing Party stand for? Does anybody know?
Nothing.
No, it stood for something. It stood against immigrants who didn't speak English. Immigrants, anti-immigrant. It's basically all it was, anti-Catholic. You could be a Catholic. Who did they hate in the Know Nothing Party? The Know Nothing Party. I forgot to tell you, this is so important. John Bell. Remember I told you he was the guy from the Constitutional Union Party? He supported the Know Nothing Party in 1856. Remember now, he's the guy, John Bell is the guy that has been put up by Kentucky to stop the breakup of the Union. The trouble is that John Bell supported the Know Nothing Party 4 years before. So anyone who was an immigrant wasn't going to vote for John Bell. Who could vote was going to vote for John Bell. But the people that were for the Know Nothing people wanted John Bell. That's why John Bell was put up there. But William Seward had been governor of New York, and when William Seward had to make a decision, he said, let the Catholics alone. Let them have their schools. They don't have to go to public school. He supported the Catholics, and he said, I'm against the Know Nothing attitude. William Seward was also an abolitionist. It was not he had made the statement that this is an irremediable conflict between slavery. Slavery was irremediable. That antagonized us. Irremediable? You mean we can't figure it out? See, Lincoln had said before, a house divided against itself cannot stand, in 1858. Lincoln's statement, a house divided against itself cannot stand, is not so bad as it's an irremediable conflict. An irremediable conflict means it can't be fixed. A house divided against itself says, so let the South go, and then we can have a house. The South was more willing to accept Lincoln's statement that a house divided against itself cannot stand because we can get out. But an irremediable conflict means we're going to have a war, right? Irremediable means we're going to, and Seward's statement was more to the people of the border states. Lincoln was more acceptable because he didn't make that rash statement that we are going to have a war. Seward did. And Seward stood for the Know Nothing, against the Know Nothing Party. And Bell had been for it. And Bell was now running for president. So the last thing, if you put Seward up, a lot of the people that would wanted to be in the Union, who would otherwise have voted for Seward, now won't vote for Seward, because they'll vote for Bell. You got it? Because Bell stood for Know Nothingism. So if you're a Know Nothing person and you hate slavery, you're going to vote for Bell because you have Seward against it. Whereas Bell is against the war and is also against the immigrant. So that put Lincoln, hittingly, he became suddenly very popular because he was the one guy that didn't stand up against the Know Nothing Party, and he didn't stand up against the South like Seward did. So Seward, who had the votes, the most votes, you got it, in the Republican Party, there were 465 delegates that met in Chicago. All you needed was a majority. But the people, remember I told you, the people wanted to win. They wanted to win. Remember I told you this is the chance, the open door was coming? Who had the best chance of winning? Seward did not. Seward could be in a position where you could have a split 3 ways. Bell could take the votes away from him because he supported the Know Nothing position. Lincoln never had to make a position on the immigrant. Lincoln never said he was for the immigrant or against the immigrant. He didn't have to. He wasn't governor of the state. Seward had to make that position. He said, I'm for the immigrant. I'm for the Catholic. Lincoln never said he's for the Catholics. He just said, I'm for the common man. And in those days, people didn't get up every day and say what they're for and what they're against. They sat back in their state. And Lincoln didn't go to Chicago. He brought in David Davis. David Davis wanted to win. He weighed 300 pounds. Big guy. He couldn't talk well, but he could organize well. And he said, basically David Davis said, how are we going to win? We don't want to be too prominent. Because if we're too prominent, we'll be knocked out. So put Lincoln in the shadows. Don't put him too far away. Because if he's too far away, no one will know him. He's there. We'll put him in his second. Let Seward shoot his wad. He's got to get a majority. Besides Lincoln, we got Salmon Chase running. We got Bates running. We got Cameron running from Pennsylvania. Cameron was a party hack. He was the governor of Pennsylvania. But he basically everyone looked at Simon Cameron in Pennsylvania, the guy was running too, as a hack. And really Simon Cameron he was like a favorite son of Pennsylvania. All he could get was Pennsylvania. But Pennsylvania wasn't going to Seward. Neither was Missouri going to Seward because it had Bates. And you had Lincoln. And Lincoln was from Illinois. And Seward obviously was going to get New York because he came from New York. It went into the vote, the first vote, in June. Remember, they wanted to win. Lincoln got 102 votes, and Seward got 156, 160, like 56. Everybody couldn't believe Seward was second. Lincoln came in with 102 votes. David Davis, this 300-pound guy, gets together with Caleb Smith of Indiana. He says, you want to win? Indiana could go. Indiana was one of those people that didn't want the immigrants, many of them. You don't want, how are you going to win? You're having an election in Indiana a month before the election you're going to win if you have Lincoln become president. So Caleb Smith said, you're right. And he switched. Indiana switched to Lincoln on the second ballot. Simon Cameron was the governor of Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, Lincoln is in Illinois, and he's telling, don't make any deals. Don't stick me with anything. I refuse to bribe my way into the White House, the nomination. But David Davis says, if Lincoln's not here, I'm going to do what I want to do. If Lincoln's not here, I'm running the show. David Davis goes up to Pennsylvania, goes up to a guy from Pennsylvania named John Casey, and says to him, Simon Cameron, we know you want your Pennsylvania. Vote the first ballot for Cameron, second ballot switch to Lincoln. That's what happened. Second ballot. Pennsylvania was worried they'd lose the election. Indiana was worried they'd lose the election. New Jersey was worried they'd lose the election. They had to go with a winner. The only one they felt was the one that was least likely to offend them. And believe it or not, Abe Lincoln was that man. So out of nowhere, on the second ballot, Lincoln was 2 votes shy of Seward, and on the third ballot, he won it all. Abe Lincoln became the nominee of the Republican Party. Now we have to, maybe next week I'll go over it again, because you're not going to get it on, but I'll tell it to this crowd here now.